Welcome to the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of RocketPD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
Teacher college preparation programs vary widely, and they're trying to cram a whole bunch of stuff into just a few semesters. But a lot of our teachers come to schools just without this kind of preparation, certainly without really intensive lesson planning preparation. But because of that, a lot of veteran teachers who also had maybe not really robust training kind of get into a habit where you just, depending on the teachers you hang out with in the first few years of teaching, you pick up stuff from them, and it's just...
If you don't know Jennifer Gonzalez by name, you almost certainly know her blog, Cult of Pedagogy. A former classroom teacher and a self-professed teaching nerd, Jenn has built one of the nation's most engaged communities of educators dedicated to effective teaching practice.
I think what a lot of teachers do, because in America anyway, we've got these schedules in schools that are so demanding and have so little time for thoughtful planning that unfortunately, I think a lot of teachers end up just going with what is going to get the greatest level of compliance from our students. So I'm going to say, here's what you need to do. And the students will say, okay, what do I need to do to get a decent grade? And we say, do this, they do it. Nobody's really happy or excited about it. I've got 3 teenagers. I can tell you from experience, they haven't been excited about school in years now. But they've all got straight A's, so figure that one out. They just know what they need to do to get through it.
On this episode of the RocketPD Podcast, Jenn takes on the myth that more teachers are disengaged and explores the art of lesson planning to help teachers both old and new build professional confidence and help students reach and exceed their potential.
I think that it's working reasonably well enough for enough students to get through that a lot of us are kidding ourselves by saying that we actually have a really good education system. I don't know that there's a lot of learning happening.
Stick around until the end, where Jenn shares details about a group she is pulling together to model powerful lesson design. So Jenn, great to have you. We were talking a little bit before we actually got on the recording about sort of this idea of like teacher confidence and this notion that there are stats out there that are sometimes pretty troubling if you just read the statistics, right? Like I think I wrote a couple of these down, but there was a whole Mifflin Harcourt study from 2022, and it said teacher confidence dropped 10% during the pandemic. It said 79% of teachers are dissatisfied with their jobs, which, those numbers kind of blow your mind a little bit. But then you go into schools and you talk to teachers. And sometimes, at least what I found, and I want to hear this from you, but is that the stats don't normally or always represent the rhetoric or the attitude. I have found in the schools that I've traveled to in the last several months that there are a lot of teachers in there who are really up for the challenge. They're excited to be with students, to try new things. And I'm just wondering what you hear, because I know, you're a self-professed teaching nerd. I think, you've got a huge following. You've built this community of educators who are excited through Cult of Pedagogy. And I'd just like to hear from you kind of what you're hearing from them.
I'm hearing both things. I am hearing a lot of teachers saying that they are overwhelmed, that it's harder than it's ever been. But I also see the same thing that you've seen, where there are still lots and lots of people who love the kids, love the work, are committed to figuring this out, and are able to somehow center themselves on most days on the parts of the job that are interesting and keep them going. And I think really the people that stick around, that are able to stick with it, have that intellectual interest in the science of the teaching and enough of a love for the kids to want to keep going and getting it figured out. And that really is the community that I've tried to build on Cult of Pedagogy too, is I worked long before the pandemic in schools where there were also both kinds of teachers. There were some who, no matter how well things were going, always had something negative to say, always could find problems. And then there were those who, no matter how tough it got, they could still have a laugh at the end of the day. They could still point out something great that happened in their classroom. And this is not toxic positivity. They just they were fit for the job, and they wanted that challenge, and they wanted to sort of keep going and figuring it out. And when I go out on speaking engagements, the people that come up to me and are the most enthusiastic about my site, the thing that makes me feel like I'm doing something right is those are always people that to me are reflecting back a really great attitude, fantastic energy, and just an intellectual thirst for, continuing to hone their craft. These are people that have been in the classroom 15, 20, 25 years who are still saying, no, I'm still working on this. I'm still trying to learn this. I'm still trying to get better. And that's exactly what I would love to see in every classroom.
So this like culture of continuous learning, students are learners, teachers are also learners, particularly the really good ones. And there are, all sorts of different ways to talk about how to help teachers build professional confidence. You and I have talked a lot about how lesson planning is one way that we can help teachers build confidence, or teachers can help them build confidence. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, if we could, kind of what that looks like. Why is lesson planning something that, when you do it right, can help you build confidence, can help you step into the role more effectively, can help you unlock maybe or unleash some of your own creativity? I just, that's a really interesting thought to me, this notion that if I can get really good at something, it can help me do other things really well.
It's, lesson planning really is the very, very core of what we do as teachers. It's the fundamental skill. If I am a basketball player and I can't just shoot a basic layup, then I'm missing one of the core skills of my profession. Same thing here. It's the same way, when my sister went to culinary school, they spent a week just on how to cook an egg. And they all thought it was ridiculous. But what their teachers taught them there is, if you don't get this down, there's going to be a lot of other stuff you're not going to be able to do well. So it's so central to what we do. And I think because we have all been to school and we've all seen people teach, a lot of people think they have a general idea of how it's done. And so a lot of us go in sort of replicating what we've seen or what we see our colleagues do. And then when it doesn't go well, which inevitably it ends up not going well if we don't sort of have a method and a set of fundamental practices, what a lot of teachers do is they will either beat themselves up and say, oh, I'm terrible at this, or they'll blame the kids and say, these kids just don't, I'm teaching and why aren't they doing what I want them to do? They'll give up. And the frustrating part about that is that there really is a science to it. And it's not even that difficult to learn, but I think that those fundamentals aren't being taught widely enough and often enough. And so when we let that stuff slip out of our hands and things don't go well, it's a very intense job. So if you don't have those fundamentals down, you can really start to lose your grip very quickly. And so with them, confidence can grow very quickly.
I want to talk about those fundamentals in just a second, but I also think that there is a fundamental difference between lesson delivery and lesson planning, or lesson delivery as a tail end part of lesson planning. So can we talk about sort of, because I think some people don't always get that right. There's a difference between standing up and delivering a lesson, or delivering a lesson in your classroom, and actually going through the process of planning for that lesson so that the lesson can be delivered in an effective way. Can we talk a little bit about that difference?
And they really are two separate skills, and they depend on each other. But yes, the planning part of it is, when I was first introduced to the idea of backward design, it was revolutionary for me. And, if I could go back to the very beginning of teaching and somebody were to teach me about that, it would change everything. But this idea of really figuring out what you want students to be able to do by the time you're done with that hour, that week, that month, that unit, whatever it is, and really, really figure out what's it going to look like if they've actually learned. How can I tell? And not only that, why do I even want them to learn this in the first place? Why is this important? And then working backwards from there and figuring out, what do I need to do to get them to that place? It shouldn't be as revolutionary as it is. And, Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, who first put this out into the world of education. God bless both of them, because if they had not done that, I don't know how many of us still would not have figured this out. But using that process, and then there's other pieces of it, understanding what, if I want the person to be able to actually perform something, what does the teaching look like to get them to perform something? If I want them to know and understand something, what do I need to do to get them to know and understand something? There's more fine tuning there, but that process can almost always get you better results than what a lot of us have done sometimes without that process, which is to say, I'm going to teach the Civil War this week. And then you just go to the textbook and you say, first we'll read this and then I'll test them on that information. And there's no thought to, well, what's the most important information for them to learn? What's the stuff that's just kind of nice to know? Instead of saying, oh, I'm going to make a 20 question test and every single question is going to be weighed the exact same. And, oh, I've got 3 more questions to come up with. What am I going to test them on? That's a very haphazard way of teaching. And it's no wonder our kids are sitting with their heads on their in their hands, or just copying everything off the internet. We bemoan this whole idea of like, oh, they're using AI and they're plagiarizing. And it's because we're not really trying to get them to learn stuff. We're trying to just get them to regurgitate things back to us. And that's why everybody's frustrated and bored. So, I'm having a soapbox moment. There's just a lot to it. And so if we...
Is this so? Let me ask you this, because I think that you kind of hit on something here, which is like there's a way to do lesson planning so that it is effective and it is engaging, and then there's sort of this rote way that we almost sort of default to. Now,
yes,
if you're is this a problem for new teachers? Is it a problem for veteran teachers? Is it a problem for both? And are the reasons the same? I mean, I'm so interested in how do we get to that place where we're just kind of going through the motions?
I think it's unfortunately a problem for both. I think it's more of a problem for newer teachers, depending on the kind of training they've had. And I can't really fault universities for this. I think that teacher college preparation programs vary widely, and they're trying to cram a whole bunch of stuff into just a few semesters. But a lot of our teachers come to schools just without this kind of preparation, certainly without really intensive lesson planning preparation. But because of that, a lot of veteran teachers who also had maybe not really robust training kind of get into a habit where you just, depending on the teachers you hang out with in the first few years of teaching, you pick up stuff from them. And it's just, I think what a lot of teachers do, because in America anyway, we've got these schedules in schools that are so demanding and have so little time for thoughtful planning that unfortunately, I think a lot of teachers end up just going with what is going to get the greatest level of compliance from our students. Yeah. So I'm going to say, here's what you need to do. And the students will say, okay, what do I need to do to get a decent grade? And we say, do this, they do it. Nobody's really happy or excited about it. I've got 3 teenagers. I can tell you from experience, they haven't been excited about school in years now. But they've all got straight A's. So figure that one out. They just know what they need to do to get through it. And so I think that it's working reasonably well enough for enough students to get through that a lot of us are kidding ourselves by saying that we actually have a really good education system. I don't know that there's a lot of learning happening.
That's so fascinating. So it's almost like we've just become accepting of this mediocrity. That to me, that's crazy, because that's everything that school should not be about, right? Like we're supposed to be teaching, not even just teaching, but inspiring kids to reach their or exceed beyond their potential, which is the opposite, I would think, of mediocrity. So talk a little bit about, that for a second, the difference between really great teaching and then this notion of, just doing enough to get by.
I think most people who became teachers were good at school and love their subject area and they love learning. So I think a lot of us are familiar with what it feels like when you are learning something new, you're excited about it, you're getting it, you're developing and building a skill, and that is such a huge hit of dopamine and serotonin and all that. And it's a great, great feeling. And I wish that we could be giving that to our students too. So it's not even that we're trying to inspire them to like be the next great inventor or the president of the United States or anything super lofty. It's one of the greatest things about being human is that experience of learning and growing. And we could be giving that to our students all the time. And I don't think that many of us are, because I think we've just sort of lost the goal. I think there's a lot of emphasis on getting test scores or, whatever it is. And I do think that COVID revealed that. Because everybody went home, and the kids, I will tell you again from experience, they cheated their way through those 2 years. They just said, why would I learn this when I can just turn the video on, walk away, and then come back later and get the question answers from Quizlet or something? And it's because the assignments were never designed to really get them. And the thing is, Corey, it doesn't even have to be. There's some great stuff out there right now with inquiry learning and project-based learning. I really believe in all that stuff. But even if you're just doing traditional lessons, even a lecture can be really, really good by applying some basic principles. And I think also our students wouldn't even mind it. They wouldn't mind death by PowerPoint if the PowerPoint was designed well and the lecture was given with some enthusiasm and some, some thoughtfulness and some good planning. And so I'm not even talking about anything that innovative. The innovative stuff is good, but without really good teaching practices underlying them, even those are going to kind of feel like, what are we doing?
So there are some red threads that kind of run through all great teaching, regardless of how it is delivered or in what mode or model. Can we talk a little bit about some of those red threads? Let's pull on them a little bit for a second. What are the sort of fundamental building blocks that every lesson, regardless of how it is delivered or the mode it is delivered in, should have?
This is so unsexy. It should have a very clear objective. Like the students should know, what am I supposed to be learning and why? And a lot of people will buy into that with just a clear objective. Also, how am I going to be evaluated on this? What is the criteria? And how will I know if I'm actually doing well as we go along? Do I care about this stuff? There are going to be a chunk of kids who will do whatever we say to do because they want to get the good grades because they've been told that this is how you get through in life. There's going to be some others who are just sort of like, I'm not going to do this unless I care about it. A lot of the stuff we teach in school, you could make students care about it. Even if you're teaching them like, some kids are just like, why do I have to read Shakespeare?
Yeah.
Because Shakespeare talks about all of these incredible human emotions. And it's a really cool thing to learn about, to see how people express themselves and how they're solving their problems. Like there's some bigger, loftier reasons to read stuff besides just getting a good grade on something. And so those threads are important. And then also, if we as teachers have an actual clear idea of how we are going to be measuring success on this, and is the tool that we're using to measure lined up with that? If I want my students to understand a certain concept, but my assessment is just asking them to just spit out dates and facts, I don't know if they actually understand it or not, because all I've measured is whether they have checked the right, A, B, C, or D on the assessment. And so those kinds of threads. And then finally, probably the most important thing is that at some point during the lesson, the students have to do something with the material. It can't just be deliver it and then assess it. There has to be this middle zone where they are either practicing a skill or applying the knowledge and information in some way. They're talking about it. They're doing some comparison. They're doing something, I call it churn, some kind of churning of this information up before they have to then prove that they learned it. And without that middle piece, I see a lot of lessons now that are just video and assessment, and there's no doing anything with it. And so there's so many different ways, dozens of ways that we can have students churn up that information in some way in order to get it into their heads in a more real way.
Yeah, you just hit on something that the light bulb kind of went off for me. It's this notion that like we have this word that we use, mastery, right? And like mastery typically is in our minds, or like on the assessment, did they show us that they knew how to do this? But there's like this thing in the middle that is like, did you give them the space to practice it, to really learn it and understand it, literally where the
Mm-hmm.
soup is kind of made here, so that when they
The cooking.
demonstrate, yeah, right.
Yes.
To me, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Like, and I think we miss that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes because we're so focused on that end thing that you mentioned, which is like, how am I as the teacher or as the school or the organization going to be graded on this? I need them to pass
Yeah.
this test or something.
Right. Which is an unfair thing, but I think really the piece of all of this is if we could figure out a way to give teachers more planning time during the day, that would solve a lot of problems. But because that's so shortened, we just shortcut into whatever's going to like kind of work. And I don't think teachers that do that are really satisfied with it.
Yeah.
But it's just a survival skill.
Right. It's like, this is what I've got to do to keep going, because I've got so much other stuff going on. And I know that at the end of the day, what they're going to come back to me about is, this was the grade on X. Did you pass it? Did you fail it?
Right.
So we got to kind of get past that mindset. I've heard a couple of like interesting things here, like this notion that, again, the why, right? Like if you're doing lesson planning and you haven't started with why, being able to tell students why this is interesting, why this is important, why they should pay attention beyond just, I told you so, then like chances are you're going to struggle with that. So then there's the why. And then there is this sort of like, figuring out ways to deliver the lesson so that it sparks creativity, it sparks engagement. Students have time to runway, if you will, to get in and to practice it, to do it, to immerse themselves in it. And then finally, there is that assessment piece. And I don't think we're saying that assessment is not important. At least that's not what I think what I'm hearing is it needs to be baked in to all of these things and done in a way that helps kids demonstrate what they've learned.
Mm-hmm. I think it needs to be a closer match to what we think it would look like out in the world. If the number of times that I've had teachers say, oh, these kids don't know what a noun is, I'm going to teach them the basics again. And it's just like, they're like ninth grade teachers. And I'm saying, stop. Having them name a noun is never going to be the most important thing. Can they write a sentence that's correct? And so it's really sort of like, does the assessment match what the skill is going to actually look like in practice? We say all the time, I see so many standards that say we want students to be able to analyze this. But then the test is just a multiple choice test asking them to identify something that is an analysis. But we've never asked them to sit down and actually do the analysis themselves, which is harder. It's harder to assess it. It's harder to teach it. Takes longer to so no wonder, again, time. But if we maybe tightened up our assessments so they weren't so long and we just focus on those really harder skills that take a little bit more repetition and sophisticated teaching, I don't know. I think it would all be a much more satisfying process.
So potentially time is a real a factor in our ability to sort of unlock this, the powers of better lesson planning within schools. Because I think what we're getting at is, it sounds like, by and large, like teachers would love to do more of this type of thing, but they are so pressured by the things that they know they're going to be measured on, or institutionally how things have kind of been handed down over the years in schools, that it's almost like they don't have the ownership or the agency to do those things. Can we talk a little bit about this idea of agency and empowerment at the teaching level, and how we get that, more of that, hopefully, in schools?
I think part of the reason, because I know that one thing that has taken away some agency from teachers is that I think a lot of schools are starting to move more and more toward prescripted programs that are all sort of set up, which some of them I've heard are actually quite good. And so if you can see this is a well-designed thing, then you move more into the delivery piece of it, where it's just like, okay, and I think it's important to have those skills of lesson planning, regardless of whether you have a prescribed program or not, because then you can assess whether it's quality or not. But the agency piece, I think, comes from administrators who have a lot of pressure on them to produce results and to solve problems. And so I think sometimes knowing that they have some teachers that have good skills and some who don't, they tend to just blanket everybody and say, we're all going to do it this way, we're all going to do it that way, which really frustrates teachers who have those skills and have that toolbox and know that it's not going to be the same thing for every kid. And so again, I think the answer is maybe in trusting more of your teachers, listening to the teachers that you know are doing really well, and trusting their instincts, not feeling like it's sort of like an equity versus equality thing again. We don't have to treat all of our teachers exactly the same. You don't have to be fair to all of the teachers. If you have some teachers that need more help and assistance and coaching, get that for them. And let the ones who you trust a little bit more to make more of their own decisions and have more agency. And it gets very political within schools. Teachers get called favorites, and some of them are, and maybe unfairly so. And so it's not an easy thing to do. But I do think that a lot of the answers for every individual school are within the walls of that school. I think it's a matter of bravely seeking feedback and listening to it from the people that are there. Usually the solution to a problem in a classroom comes from the students. A solution in a school, a lot of times, can come from those teachers. They know what the problems are and how they would fix them if somebody would just listen to them.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's not all that different. We've been preaching this idea of sort of individualizing learning for students for years. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of what I'm hearing you say is like, we need to do that for teachers in a lot of ways too, and for instructors and the people who are up there in front of students, helping them to understand concepts and to learn. It's this idea of individualizing, this idea of giving more power to the learner, in this case, the teacher as the learner. All of it is almost like if we could just turn sometimes the camera around and focus it on us as the educator for a second, and think about what the sort of mirror image would look like if we did it toward the student, right? Then it's like, wow, this kind of opens up a whole different way of thinking. But again, we're so kind of stuck in our ways and sort of, just generally obsessed sometimes with the wrong things. So just taking a step back to think about how could this look different could be huge for us. I'm just curious, like, when that does happen, and I know it happens in pockets, you're talking with people in your community through Cult of Pedagogy all the time that are doing this type of stuff. And when that happens and we start to see people taking ownership, we start to see that creativity unlocked, that passion in the classroom from the educator to the student, how does that change the mood in the school? Are there things that you can see as an educator or an administrator in terms of how students act differently, what students are doing differently, how teachers are feeling and engaging with each other? I'm curious, like, how it all changes when you put these pieces together.
When you get more than just one or two teachers working near each other in a building who have that same mindset, have that same autonomy, have that same toolbox, I mean, it's magical. And especially when you see how it affects, teacher morale affects student morale. When teachers come in drained and tired, they're not going to be doing well, and that's going to affect the students. When you have a couple of teachers who are energized and excited, and they're banded together in that kind of an attitude, it really affects the kids. The kids don't want to be bored and disengaged. I think some of them would tell you that they do because they've stopped caring and they just don't have the energy to bring to it anymore. But if they actually could see what it would look like, and sometimes you get that in a few classrooms all at once, you get a lot fewer problems with behavior. I did a post years ago called Frickin' Packets, and it was this kid. And it was built on this video that this kid had put on YouTube where he was going off on this teacher. And this kid did not come across as a student who cares that much about his education, to be quite frank. He just was sort of, but he's yelling at the teacher saying, it's no wonder these kids, you give them freaking packets every single day. And he was advocating for a more interesting education. And I really think that people say they really rag on Gen Z all the time and just say, oh, they don't care. They don't, they're just, I think they're amazing. And I think that they're just very sophisticated and kind of cynical, but I think they want to be stimulated and excited and encouraged and inspired. And so I think if you get a couple of teachers in one building that can give that to them, then you see the behavior problems go away. You see kids showing initiative, and this whole idea that they just don't care is just not true. And I just think we need to unveil it because it's under a pretty heavy veil right now.
Sure. You mentioned it. It's kind of it seems like a simple answer in a lot of ways. If you could just do this, if you could just unlock this creativity, if you just could empower, it doesn't seem like a complicated answer, but the reality is that it is, because of the way things have been institutionalized and just like the years and years and years of doing it in a particular way. And so you have to unpack all of that, and you can't do all of that at once. So if you were a new administrator and you were coming in and you were looking at, what am I going to do to empower these teachers this year? I've got a lot, there's a lot of options out there. Like, where would you start?
Yeah. I mean, where I would start as an administrator would be to ask them. And I think surprisingly, we forget to ask the people who are most impacted, what do you need the most? And how can I help you? And, I think with the newer teachers or the ones who just have not felt that successful, doing something like getting them really, really grounded in the fundamentals could help. So let's start with, do you know how to plan these lessons? Do you know how to, really structure your class so that you feel successful and you feel like your students are successful?
That's great. I have to ask you, you've been doing this a while. Again, you've built this huge community through Cult of Pedagogy. I've only known you for a few weeks now, but just your name has come up so much. I was an education journalist for many years prior to this. And so I knew of your blog. I knew of the community that you were building even back then, but your name has come up now in conversations as I've had them just in the last couple of weeks, because you've been doing this and you're recognized for that work. But there was a time when you were just a new teacher. And you were kind of going at this like for the first time, just like some of these teachers that we're hearing about now. How do you do it? So what advice would you give your former self if you were stepping into this job right for the first time and thinking there's a lot here? This is a particularly challenging time for teachers.
Yeah.
What is the one thing that you would tell yourself?
I feel like I say this all the time, but it is to go spend your time with the people who seem to love the job and who really pay attention to how you feel when you are with certain colleagues. Because I had a lot of colleagues who were toxic in different ways. Some were just super negative about the job. Some were very negative about the kids. Some were sort of on a power trip. And as a new teacher, that was sort of intimidating because you look around and say, am I supposed to be like that? Should I be more like that? Because I don't have a very strong, like assertive personality with kids. I'm a little bit of a like wet noodle sometimes. And so it would always be just like, oh, I should be like Tony, or I should be like Becky, or I should be like Janet. And it was just sort of like, I would doubt myself. But every now and then I would also find somebody who was wonderful with the students in a way that felt more organic to who I was. And they also seemed to be teaching the students really well. I had a colleague one time who used to brag all the time about how many kids she failed every semester. Not a good model for me, but it would also put a little seed of doubt in my head because she seemed so confident about it. And so that would be my main advice to myself. It would be, look for the people who, when you're around them, you're not doubting yourself, you're feeling good, you're feeling motivated, and they also seem to really be doing this job well. Everybody else, just try to like shut them out because those are not your role models.
Well, this has been great, guys. This is Jenn Gonzalez with Cult of Pedagogy. We've been talking about powerful lesson design and really how to build teacher confidence, whether you're a new teacher or a veteran teacher, just looking at the act of teaching and the art of teaching a little bit differently. Again, Jenn, this has been great. I know that you've got something going on later this year. You're pulling a group of educators together. So I thought if you guys are interested in what does a powerful lesson look like, Jenn, tell us a little bit about what's happening this fall and what you're hoping to do with this group.
Yeah. So it's called Building Teaching Confidence with Powerful Lesson Design. And it really is drilling down to the most basic element of teaching, which is just constructing a really, really well-designed lesson from the ground up. A lot of the stuff we just talked about, looking at what do I want them to be able to do by the end of this? What are my options for creating a really fine-tuned assessment that's going to line up with that goal? And then how can I choose activities and experiences for my students that are going to get them to that place? And we're just going to walk through that process. I really believe that once you've gone through that process slowly and carefully one time, then you can apply it over and over again until it's not even something you have to write down. You just sort of have it automatically. And that's what I really want. And because it's going to be a cohort, I'm hoping that the teachers are going to be able to see this process also play out for other people. So they'll see lots and lots of different models of what that looks like.
Great. Yeah. And guys, so you know that I think it's 5 sessions. It's all over Zoom. It's virtual. If you want to learn more about it, you can check it out. If you're listening to this at RocketPD.com, if you're watching this video on YouTube or somewhere else, I'll drop a link to that information in the comments so you can check it out there. Jenn, I just wanted to say again, thank you for spending a few minutes with us this afternoon. You know, we're all about trying to kind of look at education as it is, think about what's broken and have conversations about how to fix it. I think we've done that today in a lot of ways, just talking about a different approach to lesson design and what that can do for teachers. So again, I just want to thank you. Love the work you're doing at Cult of Pedagogy. I'll probably be over there later today reading some articles. I hope you guys will check that out too. Thanks again. And, hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Corey.
All right. Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the RocketPD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for RocketPD. At RocketPD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at RocketPD.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.